A German shepherd, abandoned in the harshest of conditions, left to die alone. But what if someone stepped in to rescue him? What if that person could heal the wounds of the past, both his and the dog's? This story isn't about fate. It's about second chances, trust, and an unbreakable bond that defies all odds. Khalid didn't expect to find love and healing in an abandoned puppy, but he did. This is a story of courage, transformation, and loyalty. Stay with us till the end. You won't believe what happens next. Khalid hadn't planned on coming to this neighborhood that day. He had driven through it only because he was running errands, trying to keep his mind off of the empty house he called home. Since his younger sister, Layla, had died in a car accident, Khalid's life had become a series of dull routines. He had turned away from his old passions, from the things that once made him feel alive. It was easier to numb the pain than to face it. But everything changed when the call came in. An animal rescue organization had received an anonymous tip about an abandoned dog, a German shepherd puppy, chained in the backyard of an old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. The shelter didn't have enough space. The volunteers were exhausted. The dog would be left to suffer unless someone intervened. Khalid had no idea why, but something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the echo of his sister's love for animals. Or maybe it was the desperate feeling he had every time he looked in the mirror and saw a man who hadn't lived for years. Either way, Khalid couldn't ignore it. He decided to go. When he arrived, the house was as abandoned as the dog. The paint was peeling from the walls, the windows were broken, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. But it was the backyard that caught his attention, the one place where life still clung to this wreckage. A small German shepherd puppy, barely 6 months old, was lying motionless, his body pressed against the cold concrete, his head drooping as if he had given up. Khalid's heart tightened. The dog was thin, ribs visible through its matted fur, and the chain around his neck looked tight, digging into his flesh. The puppy's eyes were dull and lifeless. There was no spark of hope left in him. Khalid knelt down slowly, speaking in a soft, comforting voice. "Hey there, little one. You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." His words didn't reach the dog immediately, but his presence did. Max, the puppy, lifted his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Khalid knew that the bond they would share could not be rushed. The puppy's trauma ran deep, and Khalid wasn't sure how he could help him heal. But one thing was clear. Max wasn't going to face the rest of his life alone. After carefully cutting the chain that bound Max, Khalid reached out, gently placing his hand on the dog's back. Max flinched at first, but then, after a few seconds, he settled under Khalid's touch. He could feel the tension in the dog's body begin to ease. It was the first sign of trust. A tiny thread, barely visible, but enough to build something beautiful from. As Khalid lifted Max into his arms, the weight of the puppy in his hands felt like a heavy responsibility. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know how long it would take to heal the scars Max carried. But one thing he knew for sure, he wasn't going to give up on him. The first few days after Khalid brought Max home were filled with quiet tension. Khalid was unsure of how to approach the puppy, who still seemed like a ghost of the dog he could become. Max didn't trust him fully. He didn't trust anyone. Khalid couldn't blame him. The puppy had known only pain and abandonment. He wasn't ready to trust another human being, even one who had rescued him from a life of neglect. Max spent the first night hiding in the corner of Khalid's living room, too afraid to move. His once proud German shepherd frame was now reduced to a fragile shell, trembling in fear. Khalid could hear him whimpering softly in the dark, and his heart broke for the little creature who had been so scarred by his past. Khalid wasn't sure what to do. He'd never been the type to deal with animals in distress. His life had always been about people, but with Max, he knew he couldn't give up. He had to figure out how to reach him. He couldn't leave him to suffer in silence. The next day, Khalid woke early, determined to help Max feel safe. He started by preparing breakfast for himself, making sure to keep his movements slow and steady. Max was watching him from the corner, his eyes wary but curious. Khalid placed a bowl of food down for the dog, then stepped back slowly, watching to see what would happen. Max didn't move at first, his eyes fixed on the food, but still hesitant. Khalid sat down across the room, his posture relaxed. He didn't want to pressure Max. Instead, he simply let the puppy take his time, hoping that Max would feel comfortable enough to eat. It wasn't until hours later, when Khalid was sitting on the couch, lost in his thoughts, that he noticed a soft scraping sound coming from the bowl. Max was eating. It wasn't much, just a few bites at first, but it was a victory. Khalid didn't rush over to praise him. He simply nodded quietly to himself, glad that Max was starting to trust him, even in this small way. The days that followed were filled with slow, quiet progress. Khalid started taking Max on short walks, keeping the leash loose, letting Max explore at his own pace. The first walk was nothing short of a struggle. Max would freeze at every unfamiliar sound or sight, his tail tucked between his legs, his body tense with anxiety. But Khalid was patient. He stayed calm, never forcing Max to do anything he wasn't ready for. It was a gradual process, but after a few days, Max started to walk with more confidence. The fear in his eyes began to fade, replaced by curiosity. Khalid couldn't help but feel proud of the little victories, the way Max would sniff the grass with growing interest, the way his tail would wag just a little bit when Khalid came home. There was still a long way to go, but Khalid could see the spark of life beginning to return to Max. One evening, as Khalid sat on the porch, Max curled up beside him. He felt a strange sense of peace. It was the first time since Layla's death that he had felt anything resembling contentment, and it was in that moment that he realized something. This wasn't just about rescuing Max. It was about healing himself too. The puppy had reminded him of the love and trust he had lost, of the joy in taking small steps forward, of giving something a chance to grow, even when it seemed like there was no hope. Max had been broken, but Khalid had been too. They were both healing together, step by step, and though Max still had a long road ahead of him, Khalid knew he was there to guide him through it. They had come into each other's lives for a reason, to help each other find the way back to trust, to love, and to hope. Weeks had passed since Khalid had brought Max into his home. Each day, the puppy grew stronger and more trusting. Khalid could see the shift in Max's eyes, the fear slowly fading, replaced by curiosity, then tentative joy. It was as though Max was finally beginning to understand that not all humans were like the one who had abandoned him. Khalid had become more than a rescuer. He was a friend, a protector. But the road to healing wasn't straight. Every now and then, Max would freeze at a certain sound or smell, his body trembling as though the past had come rushing back. Khalid learned to be patient, to wait for the storm to pass. But even Khalid couldn't predict when the darkness would return. One rainy afternoon, Khalid was sitting in the living room, his eyes focused on his work, when he heard a faint whimper. He looked up, only to find Max standing by the door, his body tense, eyes wide with panic. Khalid felt his heart race. Max had been fine just minutes ago, lying comfortably on the rug beside him. "Max?" Khalid called softly, but the dog didn't respond. Instead, Max began pacing back and forth, his tail tucked tightly between his legs, his breathing quick and shallow. Khalid stood up slowly, approaching the dog with caution. He had seen Max react like this before, but never with such intensity. "Hey, it's okay," Khalid murmured, kneeling down to Max's level. "What's wrong, buddy? You're safe." But Max didn't calm. His eyes were wide, his body trembling uncontrollably. Khalid's heart clenched. He had no idea what had triggered this, but he knew that Max was reliving something terrifying, something from his past that Khalid couldn't reach. Max suddenly lunged toward the door, scratching at it frantically, his whimpers escalating into full-fledged cries of distress. Khalid's instinct was to pull him away, to stop him, but he hesitated. Was Max trying to escape, or was there something outside that he feared? Khalid glanced through the window, but the only thing he saw was the rain pouring down, the world outside as still and quiet as ever. He turned back to Max, who was now backing away from the door, his body low to the ground, eyes wide in terror. That's when Khalid realized the puppy wasn't reacting to the rain or the storm outside. He was reacting to something deeper, something buried in the darkness of his past. Khalid reached out gently, his voice steady and calm. "Max, come here. You're okay. I'm here. You're safe." Max stopped pacing and turned to Khalid, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. Slowly, cautiously, he walked back to Khalid's side. Khalid wrapped his arms around him, pulling him close. "I've got you," he whispered. "You don't have to face this alone." For a long moment, Max simply stood there, trembling in Khalid's arms, his breathing shallow. Khalid could feel the dog's heart racing, could feel the weight of the trauma that still clung to him. And yet, in that moment, Khalid also felt something else. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was there. Max wasn't giving up, and neither was Khalid. As the storm outside raged on, the two of them stayed in the quiet of the house, a silent understanding passing between them. Khalid didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how long it would take for Max to heal, or how many more storms they would have to face. But he knew one thing. They would face them together. The rain had stopped, but the days that followed brought with them an eerie stillness. Khalid had noticed it in Max, how the puppy's energy had begun to dwindle, how he would no longer dart around with the playful abandon he once had. The growth they had made together seemed to stall, and Khalid's concern grew. He wasn't a vet, but he knew something wasn't right. Max was no longer his energetic, curious self. He seemed withdrawn and lethargic. One evening, as Khalid sat at the kitchen table, he noticed Max staring at the door, his body stiff, his eyes dull with exhaustion. The dog had barely touched his food that day, and Khalid's worry gnawed at him. Was Max sick? Was there something wrong? "Come here, Max," Khalid called, but the dog didn't move. For a brief moment, Khalid felt the weight of his own helplessness. He wanted to be the one to fix things, to make everything right for Max. But he was just a man, doing the best he could. He stood up, walking slowly to the dog, kneeling beside him. "Hey, buddy. What's going on?" Khalid murmured, his voice soft and gentle. He ran a hand over Max's fur, but the dog didn't react. It was then that Khalid realized. The puppy was trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something physical. Khalid's heart sank. Without a second thought, he grabbed his jacket and bundled Max into his arms. They needed to get to the vet. The vet's office was quiet, a soft hum of voices and the scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. Khalid sat in the waiting room, nervously tapping his foot, his heart heavy with worry. Max lay across his lap, his head resting in Khalid's hands, his once vibrant eyes now dull with fatigue. Khalid's mind raced with questions. What if the dog was too far gone? What if he hadn't been able to save him after all? Finally, the vet appeared. She was a woman in her early 30s, kind eyes and a warm smile. She immediately crouched down to Max's level, her hands gently checking his body, running her fingers along his ribs and legs. Max let out a soft whimper, and Khalid's heart clenched in his chest. After a few minutes, the vet straightened up, her expression serious. "He's suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and exhaustion," she explained. "It's not uncommon for dogs who've been neglected like this to have these symptoms. But don't worry, we can treat him. It's going to take time, but with the right care, he'll recover." Khalid let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Max wasn't going to die, he wasn't too far gone. There was hope, but the vet wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said softly. "There's a chance that Max has some psychological scars as well. Dogs who've been through severe trauma often carry emotional wounds that take longer to heal than physical ones. It might take months, possibly even years, before Max truly feels safe again." Khalid nodded, his stomach sinking. He had known that Max's journey would be long, but hearing it from the vet made it more real, more daunting. He didn't know how he would do it, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up on Max. "I can do it," Khalid said quietly, more to himself than to the vet. "I won't give up on him. He's come this far." The vet smiled warmly. "I believe you can. Just remember, patience and consistency will be key. Max needs time, and he needs you." Khalid nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just taking care of Max's body anymore. He was taking care of his heart and soul, and he wasn't going to let Max face the darkness alone. As Khalid drove home, Max resting in the back seat, he thought about the journey ahead. The road would be long, and the obstacles would come, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had already faced the worst of it, both for Max and for himself. Together, they would find a way to heal. When they arrived back at the house, Khalid carefully helped Max out of the car, feeling the weight of their shared journey. Max still seemed fragile, but Khalid knew that this was only a temporary phase. The puppy had already come so far, and so had Khalid. And just as Max had found the strength to trust again, Khalid had found the strength to keep going. They were in this together, and that was all that mattered. Khalid had been doing everything in his power to help Max heal. He made sure the puppy was eating, drinking, and getting the medication he needed. Slowly but surely, Max's health was improving. His ribs were no longer as prominent, and his coat, once dull and patchy, had started to regain some luster. But while the physical changes were encouraging, there was still something deeper that Max couldn't shake. It was the fear, the invisible weight of his past that hung over him, especially during the night. Khalid had noticed it first when Max started to react to the slightest noise, a creak in the floorboards, the sound of a car passing by, or even the wind rustling the trees outside. His body would tense up, his breathing would become shallow, and he'd retreat into a corner, his eyes wide with panic. Khalid didn't know how to fix it. He had tried everything he could think of: slow, calm interactions, lots of affection and patience, but nothing seemed to reach Max during those episodes. It was as though Max's fear was too deep, too ingrained. One particular evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house was eerily quiet. Khalid was in the kitchen, making dinner, when he heard it, a loud banging noise from the living room. It was enough to make his heart leap into his throat. He rushed out, dropping his kitchen towel in shock. Max was standing in the middle of the room, his body trembling violently, eyes wide, staring at the front door. Khalid didn't know what had triggered it, but the fear was clear. Max was in the throes of a panic attack. His tail was tucked between his legs, and he was pacing in circles, his breathing labored. Khalid's heart shattered at the sight. "Max," Khalid whispered. But the puppy didn't respond. He was too far gone in his own terror. Khalid tried to approach slowly, but Max took a step back, his eyes locked on the door. There was something in the air, something that Khalid couldn't see or understand, but Max felt it with an intensity that Khalid couldn't ignore. It was as if the house, the people in it, and the world outside were all part of the same storm that had never passed for Max. Khalid's first instinct was to grab the leash and pull Max out of the room, to do something, anything, to end the panic. But he hesitated. Max had never responded well to being forced. He needed patience, not force. Khalid took a deep breath, and instead of pulling Max away, he lowered himself to the ground. "Max," Khalid said softly, "I'm here. You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you." Max didn't respond. He continued to pace, his eyes darting back to the door, as if he expected it to open and bring something, someone, back. Khalid's heart ached for him. Max had been abandoned, and the memory of that loss was still haunting him. Khalid had to do something. He couldn't let Max go through this alone. In a moment of clarity, Khalid remembered the one thing that had always calmed Max in the past: the sound of his voice. Slowly, he began to talk to him, quietly, steadily, with words of comfort. He didn't try to move or touch Max. He simply spoke. "I'm not going anywhere," Khalid said, his voice low and reassuring. "You're safe here. I'm not leaving you." Minutes passed, but Khalid didn't stop talking. He spoke about the little things, how beautiful the night sky was, how he had seen a bird perched on the windowsill that morning, how he'd made Max's favorite dinner. Anything to ground Max in the present, to remind him that the past no longer had control over them. Slowly, ever so slowly, Max began to settle. His pacing slowed, his breathing steadied, and his body began to relax. Khalid continued to speak, every word a thread tying them closer together. It wasn't a quick fix, and Max wasn't fully recovered, but in that moment, Khalid could see it. He could see the bond between them growing stronger. Max was starting to trust him again, even in the midst of his fear. When Max finally lay down, exhausted but calmer, Khalid let out a sigh of relief. He stayed there on the floor, watching over the puppy as he rested. Khalid realized something important in that moment. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning how to live with it, together. And so, as the night settled around them, Khalid stayed by Max's side. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever. It had been several months since Max had entered Khalid's life. The puppy who had once been a shadow of fear and brokenness had slowly blossomed into something stronger, more confident. Khalid had watched him grow, seen the changes in his body and his spirit. The trust they had built together was unshakable, but there was still one final test to come, one more obstacle that would reveal just how far they had come. It started with a phone call. Khalid had been sitting on the porch with Max, his hand resting on the dog's fur as they watched the sun sink behind the hills. The phone rang, and Khalid picked it up without thinking. "Khalid, it's Layla's sister, Nora," the voice on the other end said. "I'm sorry to call you like this, but there's something I need to tell you. There's a possibility that we'll have to sell the house. The bank is putting it up for auction next month." Khalid's heart dropped into his stomach. The house, the home he had shared with Layla, was everything to him. It was where he had proposed to her, where they had planned their future together. It was a piece of the life he had lost, a piece that had held him together in the darkest times. Why now? Khalid's voice was barely a whisper, as if the news had stolen the air from his lungs. "There are debts to pay, Khalid," Nora replied gently. "We've tried to work it out, but there's nothing more we can do. I'm sorry." The weight of those words hung in the air, and Khalid could feel a familiar ache in his chest. He looked down at Max, who was watching him with gentle eyes, his tail wagging slowly. For a moment, Khalid felt completely alone. The house was slipping away from him, just as Max had once slipped through his fingers. His grief over Layla, the loss of their life, came rushing back in full force. Max seemed to sense the change in Khalid's demeanor. The dog slowly rose from his spot beside him and walked over, nudging Khalid's leg with his head. Khalid's heart tightened. In that moment, Max was his only anchor, the only constant he had left in this world. And yet, even that felt uncertain. "Max," Khalid murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what to do." Max rested his head on Khalid's knee, looking up at him with those deep, trusting eyes. It was as if the puppy was telling him that everything would be okay, that they would face whatever came next together, just like they had faced everything before. But Khalid couldn't help the wave of despair that crashed over him. He didn't know how he could go on without this house, this home that had been the last piece of his old life. He didn't know if he was strong enough to start over, to leave behind the memories of Layla and everything they had dreamed of. The next few days were filled with sleepless nights and anxious thoughts. Khalid considered moving away, starting fresh somewhere else. But he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the only place that had felt like home, even after all the pain it held. Then came the final blow. One evening, as Khalid stood in front of the house, his hands in his pockets, he heard a voice behind him. "Are you okay, Khalid?" It was Nora again, her voice soft but concerned. He turned to face her, his heart heavy. "I don't know, Nora. I don't know how to let go of this place. It's all I have left of her." Nora nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I understand. But, Khalid, maybe it's time to start a new chapter. Layla would have wanted you to move forward. She would have wanted you to be happy." The words hit Khalid like a physical blow. Layla, she would have wanted him to be happy. She would have wanted him to heal, to live again, just as he had helped Max heal. He looked at the house and at the memories of Layla that lingered in every corner. And then, for the first time in a long while, he realized something. It wasn't the house that made him feel whole. It was the love, the bond, the memories that lived inside him. And those memories would always be with him, no matter where he went. Khalid turned back to Max, who was sitting at his feet, watching him with those loyal, loving eyes. "You're right, Nora," Khalid said softly. "It's time to move forward." He bent down to pet Max, his heart lifting as the dog leaned into his touch, his tail wagging gently. They didn't need the house to be happy. They just needed each other. And so, in that moment, Khalid made a decision. He would stay in the house for now, but he wouldn't let it define him. He would build a new life for himself and Max, one where the past no longer had the power to control them. Together, they would move forward. Together, they would find happiness again. The days had passed in a blur, each one marked by small victories and challenges, each one leaving a deeper impression on Khalid's heart. Max had grown stronger, and so had he. The puppy who had once been a shell of fear was now running through the yard with unbridled joy, his fur gleaming under the sunlight. Khalid couldn't remember a time when he had seen Max this happy, this full of life, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Khalid found himself smiling again, truly smiling. It was early morning when Khalid stood in front of the house one last time, taking in the view of the yard where he had spent so many quiet moments with Max. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over everything. He hadn't expected to feel this calm after everything that had happened, after the pain of losing Layla, after the fear and uncertainty of Max's recovery, after the struggle with the house and its memories. But here he was, standing tall, his heart full of peace. Max was at his side, of course, his tail wagging as he bounded over to Khalid, his eyes full of life. Khalid reached down to scratch behind his ears, a gesture that had become second nature. "This is it, buddy," Khalid murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We're leaving. We're starting fresh." Max let out a soft bark, as if he understood. He seemed to sense that something was different today, something significant. The bond between them, once fragile and tentative, was now unbreakable. They had been through the worst together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. They had healed each other in ways neither of them could have imagined when their paths first crossed. It was time to say goodbye to the house, to the past, and to step into a new chapter, one filled with possibilities. Khalid looked around the yard, memories flooding his mind. He thought of the first day he brought Max home, how lost and broken the puppy had seemed. He thought of the struggles, the sleepless nights, the times when he had wondered if he could do it. But now, with Max by his side, he realized that the journey had been worth it. The bond they shared was worth every hardship, every tear. It had brought them both back to life. "You ready?" Khalid asked, his voice steady. Max looked up at him, his ears perked, his eyes filled with trust. It was a simple question, but the weight of it was profound. They were ready to face whatever came next, ready to start fresh, ready to live without the chains of the past holding them back. With one last look at the house, Khalid turned and walked toward the car, Max trotting beside him, his steps light and confident. They had everything they needed right there. They had each other. As Khalid drove down the road, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't running away from his past. He was moving forward with it. He had the memories of Layla in his heart, and he always would, but he had learned something important. He didn't have to let grief define him. He didn't have to live in the shadow of what he had lost. Max's head rested on Khalid's lap as they drove, the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing filling the car. Khalid's hand gently rested on Max's back, a silent promise that he would never let go. They had been through too much together, and now they were free to live, free to love. "Together," Khalid whispered, as if to seal the promise. "We're in this together, Max." And for the first time in a long time, Khalid felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty, just the road ahead, and the dog who had saved him in ways he never could have imagined. They were going to be okay. Khalid and Max's journey wasn't just about healing. It was about rediscovering hope, finding strength in each other, and learning that no matter how dark the past may be, the future holds endless possibilities. Together, they proved that love, resilience, and a loyal heart can overcome anything. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of love and second chances. Together, we can spread hope, one story at a time.